Okay.
I understand.
Everybody who will be watching this, I'm interviewing the awesomely cool Christian McKay Heidicker. Heidicker, right?
Nailed it. Yeah.
Cool. Author of Scary Stories for Young Foxes, which is super cool that it was a Newbery honor. That's awesome. And also Attack of the 50-Foot Wallflower, and oh man, I'm blanking on the other YA one.
Cure for the Common Universe.
Yes, definitely want to get those two for our library.
Great, and I have another middle grade too.
Oh, what is it?
It's called Thieves of Weirdwood. It's
cool.
Fantasy set in early 20th century. It just came out in April.
Awesome. Congrats. That's so cool.
Thank you.
Well, I guess my first question, was it harder or easier for you to write middle grade as opposed to YA? And are you going to be writing more in the future?
So to answer your second question first, I will only be writing middle grade from this point forward. Mostly because I just think that is the age of my heart. You know, I still feel like an 11-year-old. And that's a really interesting question of whether it was easier or harder. It was easier because I found more joy in it. I love middle grade, and especially spooky middle grade. So I would get more excited to like go to the story and make it better. But it was harder because I cared more. So I, spent a lot more time refining the language and the stories and the emotional beats. So simultaneously, harder and easier, I would say.
Very nice. One of the things, speaking of kid lit, one of the things that I like about it is that it has the anthropomorphization, which is not really a thing in YA or adult literature.
Right.
And even though Yuli and Mia were foxes, they had such great personalities that I was like thinking of them as friends, even though they were foxes. Yes. What I also liked about them was that you wrote them so that they saw the world as foxes and not people. Was it hard to stop thinking like a human and start thinking like a fox in order to write them? Also, I loved it when you used underpaw instead of underfoot.
So, funny story, when I originally wrote these, I was inspired by, or when I wrote the original stories, I was inspired by Berenstain Bears, like the really spooky installments of those, Spooky Old Tree and Bears in the Night. So when I first envisioned these, they were actually very much like Berenstain Bears, little foxes like wearing little deerskin boots and walking on two paws and going down to the corner store to buy a roasted duck. And then my agent was the one who was like, anthropomorphism doesn't sell. People really, really have a hard time with it. And so then I started to sway it more scientifically and really looking at fox experiences. And I think that the fox sense of it and to not think like a human came in layers of drafts. Because there was a draft where I would call Beatrix Potter a witch, or Mr. Scratch a vampire, or all of these things, and then started to take those out and replace them with more like National Geographic terms. And then just like in terms of just a sensory experience, things like underpaw would come in like later drafts when I would just be like, all right, what's it like? Getting down on all fours and walking around my apartment.
Nice.
I might have done that a couple of times.
Speaking of thinking and seeing and being a fox, I can definitely tell you did a lot of research for it. Details such as the milk teeth and starting off life with blue eyes. I didn't even know that Fox Kit started off with blue eyes, and how the Kit's father was the one who was supposed to bring in fresh food for the first 10 weeks. What resources did you use for your research, and what were some fun fox facts that didn't make the book but were still pretty cool to learn?
Oh, so the first thing that I did was I went down to the library and I pulled every single Fox book off the shelf, including in the kids section, and just read them cover to cover. just so I would have like a global understanding. And that's the thing about animals, is that we're always like, oh, a hippo. What's there to know about a hippo? And then you discover that they excrete their own suntan lotion, and they're the only animal with a webbed hoof, and they have funerals, and they're vegetarians, but they kill more people than any other animal in the world, and they're most related to the dolphin because they communicate with sonar underwater. I used to teach science to kindergartners in Beverly Hills, and I would just teach them these things, and I would always be so shocked at like how much I didn't know. And so I wanted to glean as much as I could from foxes. And yeah, I just scoured the internet, scoured the library, went on Amazon and bought every book I could, and just took many, many notes. And I think like most of the facts that I got in there were in there one way or the other. I think it's hilarious that foxes don't like to eat shrews. They think they're disgusting. They will torture them and kill them, but then they'll just leave them to die. Like they just think they taste gross. And so that comes in a couple of jokes within the book, but it's never explicit. But I think the thing that always shocks people, and in fact, they almost asked me to take out of the book, is the purple. Whenever a fox looks north, their vision actually changes. And they've discovered that they're 40% more likely to catch their prey if their muzzles are pointing northward. And they think that's because foxes have, or might have, some metal in their eyes, just like birds have metal in their beaks, and that's how they know where to migrate. And that was fascinating to me. Like that felt otherworldly, and like I made it up, but I didn't. It's totally true.
So I thought it was interesting that Mia knew about the purple, but Yuli didn't seem to know about it. Did he also have that capability, but just he wasn't trained and taught like Mia was? Or do the female foxes have more ability to gauge with the purple?
I think you got it on the first one. I think it's a matter that Uli's mom did not take the time to train him for these things because she was doing so much of the work for him. And that hurt him in a big way, and I wanted Mia just to have a better sense of what it was meant to be a fox, whereas Uli was lacking these things. But yeah, I think you nailed it.
Speaking of the senses, the scent plays a huge role. There's the lavender smell of Mr. Scratch and the yellow smell of infected foxes. And I actually looked up the symbolism of lavender purple and the color yellow and learned that the purple lavender can symbolize royalty and luxury, which in some aspects kind of fits Mr. Scratch, but I don't want to give away, obviously, things. But I also learned that the color yellow can symbolize betrayal and madness. Did you choose those on purpose, or was it just a happy coincidence?
So the lilac is a way that people have described a fox's scent, a territorial scent. And I think it's going to be considerably more sickening to you or I to smell it, but to Vixen, it might be a little more enticing. And then I actually hadn't thought about like purple being royalty and Mr. Scratch's royalness. So that one is definitely a coincidence. The yellow was intentional in terms of that stuff. Yeah, I remember being in college and reading the yellow wallpaper about this oppressive force. And it also was something like, in my sense, like anything that you smelled that was yellow would probably be really unsettling and disgusting. So yeah.
I just want to say that as I was reading the part with Beatrix Potter, I was texting my boss and saying, I will never think of her the same way again. What made you think of that?
So I was in the middle of writing the Fox stories, and a friend of mine sent me an article that claimed that Beatrix Potter stuffed all of her subjects before drawing them. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. she's going to be my witch figure, you know, because then there's this duality about her. And so I started doing as much Beatrix Potter research as I could. And it's true, like she was this avid scientist. And she was so talented and so intelligent, and unfortunately completely blocked from the scientific community, and her papers and sketches turned down because she was a woman, and that was not acceptable at the time in those communities. And so she is this like very tragic, but very intelligent figure. And many of the lines that are in the stories, I lifted straight from her letters and her diary, which I read. She does call baby pigs little cherubs. She does say it's vital in order to be able to draw something or write about it that you have to be able to touch it and smell it and feel it. And so she was really hands-on with all of this stuff. I realized that I unfortunately vilified Miss Potter maybe for life. But I admire her. I think she's amazing. I think that her books are amazing. I think that her sketches are peerless and all these things. I do think that she had that darker side, and the big part of that was like the perception of animal awareness at the time. And I will say that she never stuffed Peter Rabbit. He was her pet, and so she just like kept him. But one funny thing is that Junyi Wu, the illustrator for Scary Stories for Young Foxes, just illustrated the biography for Beatrix Potter that shows like her brighter side. So Junyi has explored like all sides of Beatrix Potter.
Cool. That brings me to my next question, which was, I love the book, like the story, but I also like the physical aspect of the book. The illustrations were delightfully spooky, and for some reason I also like the font of the book, and how pages reminded me of a chalkboard, almost like a creepy chalkboard made of bones and ivy. Did you have any input on the stylistic decisions at all?
No. I got a brilliant team over at Holt. They would send me early sketches that Junyi was doing and ask for my input and make sure they just kind of captured the things. And I think one of the brilliant things that the designer, Carol Lai, did for the book was that she pulled classic horror movie posters like Fright Night for Lilac Kingdom, and then had Junyi recreate those in a way with foxes. But no, they don't come to me for any of those things. In fact, you just made me like that font so much more. Like, I realized how easy it is to read, and I appreciated that about it, but the idea that it's like spookily written on a chalkboard is just wonderful. So thank you for that.
No problem. This next question is more about craft and plotting. I liked how Mia and Uli spent the first half of the book following their own separate storylines, and then their stories merged in the second half. What was the writing process like for the book? Was it easier to write them when they were together or when they were on their own?
Oh, yeah, great question. So I want to start by saying that when I first wrote the book, the whole thing was written from Mia's perspective, and she just ran into this fox in the forest. And then we did not know his history. Like he kept it to himself. And it was my editor who encouraged me to craft a story specifically for him and then to go back and forth. And I thought that that was a really, really good choice. Creak Thump, the moment where Uli and Mia meet up for the first time, is my favorite story in there. And I think it's because it was easier for me to write them together. It felt more joyful. They're the missing piece that the other one doesn't realize they really need in order to get through this horrifying adventure. And before that, yeah, it was tough. It's tough to be locked inside of Kit's brain. It's tough to have them not be able to have somebody their own age to play off of. So yeah, it was much more exciting to write them together, especially because, like so many duos, they really, each one embodied the thing that the other one lacked. In terms of structure, I used story circles, Dan Harmon's story circles. And basically, he just kind of shows that every single story has the same shape. And so Mia and Uli are going on the first part of their journey individually, and then when they overlap, they unite and are together. And so yeah, that was very deliberate, and I was very, very careful about the structure to keep the pacing and everything. And yeah, great eye.
Nice. A bit more about craft. I kind of called it in my head the Princess Bride style of telling a story, because you have almost like two different realities. One is the Uli and Mia existing in the stories, but then you have the storyteller, hence like the Princess Bride aspect of it. And I think that perfectly translates into campfire style, telling it together. How did you do that? Because it almost feels like the foxes that are listening, they fade into the background when Yuli and Mia come, but they're also really integral throughout it. Well, I just want to hear more about that.
Yeah, so once again, that was my editor saying that he felt like the story was missing something. Because just tossing the reader straight into Miss Vix, which, let's face it, is a really terrifying story. It's really brutal from the get-go, and he was talking to me about that, and I was like, okay, I think I might have an idea in how to soften it and make the reader feel safe, and also to give it a lens through which you could understand that while terrible things might happen, that there are really great opportunities for growth and understanding. And so that's kind of what those stories became. And those were hands down the easiest part of this book to write. I love doing it. I love capturing the storyteller's voice. And I just want to live in that world. That became the Berenstain Bears aspect of this story, just still keeping it as foxish as I could. A friend of mine who's a genius and a poet read it, and at one point all 7 of the fox kits had names, and it was so unwieldy, and I didn't realize just how unwieldy it was. And he said, well, what if you just take their names away and you make them the alpha and the beta, and then the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th. And all of a sudden, it did the thing that you described, which is allowed them to fade into the background, which is that this could be any fox kit, it's any kid listening to this story, but they don't need to have this heroic title, except for maybe one by the end. You know.
Well, we won't talk about that.
We won't talk about that. That's just my teaser. That's just...
So these next few questions exit the world of the book and go into the world of your experience in publishing and everything. So I know you worked in education. Does that help inform you what to write, what market there is, what kids are interested in and everything?
That's a good question. I think it worked its way into my bone marrow so completely that I'm not sure that I sit down and really think about it. This was an idea that I was just personally excited about, and there weren't any other comparable books in the world. And so I was like, well, let's fill that space and then use whatever tactics necessary to make sure that it's kid friendly and kid and intriguing. But I think being a science teacher for a long time, I came to understand what kids thought was really interesting and exciting. And then doing a lot of educational writing, I learned like what vocabulary was appropriate for what ages, like what felt like universal language and what felt a little bit too complex. So yes, yeah, absolutely it helped. In terms of the market though, That is such a hard thing to read. Even my editors and the sales team and everything, like they are way more in tune with that than I am.
My next question was, what advice would you give to young writers? Because I have a few kids that I work with who love to write. So what advice would you give them? Or to yourself when you were young and writing, if you wrote when you were younger?
Yeah, so I would say that copying your favorite authors is always really good. Finishing the things that you start is really vital. And even if that means you're doing a terrible job just to get to the end of it, having a whole thing that you can look at and analyze, accept the fact that what you write, you're going to need to fix a lot over and over and over again. There's none of your favorite writers have just like written something and it was great. They'll write it, they'll fix it, they'll write it again, they'll change it, they'll throw it away, they'll fix it. So accept that part of it for sure. And then I would say, like, whatever can help you cheat. I always stayed away from things like story structure and learning about 3 acts. And this is the part where you introduce the characters, and this is the part where an exciting thing happens, and this is the part where things change. That will help you so much. Having a skeleton on which to hang your exciting ideas is what gets books sold. You know, if you go to the bookstore and you pull any book off the shelf, it has a structure like that. And for a long time, I thought that was cheating. I thought that made it formulaic and predictable, and it doesn't. It just allows human minds to understand it.
What about for those writers who are starting out and they're writing something that they really like, but then maybe they read a book and the book is kind of similar to what they're doing, and then you start overthinking what you're writing. You're like, should I just throw it out because it's already there in the world? Just
Nope.
Going with it and follow through.
Yeah, don't even worry about it, because there will always be something that's similar in the world. Foxes has Watership Down, it has Berenstain Bears. It bears a lot of similarities to, I don't know.
Scary stories to tell in the dark.
Scary stories to tell in the dark, exactly. If anything, that helps me and would help you, because people get like a tingle in their head where they're like, oh, I really like that thing. I want more of that thing. How about this? And so I think that the danger, having something that you've already written be similar to something that's out or is coming out or whatever, is fine. It's so fine. You are going to be unique. You're going to stand out because you're just telling your personal story that's so different from this other person's story. I would advise you against copying something that's already in the world intentionally.
Yeah, there's a word for people like that.
Plagiarists.
Yeah, it's not a good thing.
Yeah. But that doesn't mean that you can't take the spirit of it or the individual ingredients that go into a genre or a trope and just make them your own.
So in a way, kind of everything is connected. A writer writes something, then a reader reads it, and then that makes some aspect of the story resonates with them. And they're like, that's cool, but what if I wrote something that made me think of this and go in this other direction? So kind of like it's a never-ending circle, kind of like the story circle you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. And in fact, when I went to sell this book, I was like, listen, it's scary stories to tell in the dark, but it's for foxes.
Boom.
Yeah, and they were like, where's our checkbook? It wasn't that simple at all. It took me a very long time to actually craft the pitch and everything, but yeah.
That's awesome. All right, I think I have 2 final questions. Right. And that is, what are you reading right now? And how do you stay creative in the stifling, mind-numbing time of Corona?
Yeah, so right now I just finished The Inquisitor's Tale by Adam Gidwitz. Absolutely just beautiful and scary and challenging and surprising and just very much his own thing. I actually used A Tale Dark and Grim as a barometer for how scary I could make scary stories for young foxes. So That was really great. And I'm listening to Joe Abercrombie's The Blade Itself, which I'm also enjoying a great deal. And in terms of like the mind-numbing time of Corona, I've been on deadline for 3 years, so life has not changed that much for me personally. But I wake up every morning and I meditate for 20 minutes and then I exercise. I've been playing Ring Fit on the Nintendo Switch, and then I do a brain game, and then I learn Gaelic on Duolingo. And then I set to work and then read and watch horror movies with my fiance to finish out the evening and inspire.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I think that was my final question, but this was so much fun, and I definitely want to read all of your other books and get them for our library.
Marvelous.
I
You might
really
be happy to
appreciate you
hear.
taking the time.
Yeah, no problem. You might be happy to hear that I will be turning in Scary Stories for Young Foxes 2.
Yes!
That's the reaction that I want. So it takes place many years later when all of these natural environments have been leveled and replaced by streets and buildings and everything. And this new generation of fox kids will have to learn how to survive exterminators and automobiles and all of these more modern horrors.
Here's my credit card, buying it right
now. Thank you for your excellent questions. That was really fun.
No problem. All right. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.